Okay, let's begin. Do the NATO thing. NATO, Wikipedia, where all good research starts. Sweden isn't mentioned a single time in the Wikipedia page? Are you serious? Oh man. In December 2021, the military foreign minister of Russian affairs, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs put together an 8-point draft treaty with a list of security demands of the Western Alliance. These include reverting NATO forces to 1997 positioning, banning new members from joining the alliance, and limiting NATO's presence in Eastern Europe. Washington responded that these points were unrealistic as they would entail the removal of multiple Eastern European countries from the NATO alliance and capitulate to Russia's desire for a greater sphere of influence over its neighbors. Big true. Absolutely true. A lot of Eastern European nations are rightfully terrified of leaving NATO because you see what happens when you leave NATO. Russia has done the best advocates for joining NATO and NATO alliance over the past few decades has, without a shadow of a doubt, been Russia. Unironically, like everything they have done, everything that they're doing is actively reinforcing and actively telling more countries and giving countries more reason to join NATO. And even if you look at the history thing, Russia really liked fucking with Eastern European countries because they like expand their sphere of influence. You know, Putin is somebody who has I think they call it the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the disillusionment of the Soviet Union, who wants to once again like grow the kind of Russian or Soviet Empire or whatever you want to call it, and who has demonstrated time and time again that they will mess with, they will interfere with, they will fuck with Eastern European countries if they aren't properly protected. However, once a country joins NATO, Russia can no longer do that, and that makes Russia sad, and that makes Russia very upset. But that makes us Eastern European countries, they're like, we're chilling now. Joining NATO was the best thing we ever did. So not only, are these demands really unrealistic because why? What's the purpose? The only reason why this would be like something that would be needed is if you believe that like NATO is planning to launch like an offensive into Russia, which if you believe that, you're on different level of operating within reality. Whatever you're having, whatever you have going through your bloodstream at that point in time while you're thinking those thoughts, while you believe that, I really want that, and I'm going to become a millionaire selling that because that's some of the best drugs I have ever heard of my entire life. But regardless, apart from that, NATO, the primary purpose of NATO is to protect against Russian imperialism and Russian interventionism, which is something that Russia has demonstrated time and time again, most recently now with Ukraine, that they will do if there isn't sufficient dissuasion. And NATO has been shown to be often sufficient dissuasion. So these demands from Russia is just, hey, can you do this so we can do imperialism more? That is effectively what it is. And Washington's like, no, literally, why would we do that? And I bet a lot of the Eastern European countries were like, fuck no, do not leave. Please, no. We need more protection. We can't go back to how it was in 1997 because a lot of countries, Eastern European countries, have joined NATO since then. So yeah, once again, no, Russia, we will not let you take those countries. In a show of force, Russia positioned an estimated 100,000 troops along its border with Ukraine, with many fearing an imminent invasion of Ukraine. Renewed debates over NATO's Eastern European enlargement ambitions, the potential for future Russian aggression, and uncertainty over Russia's future have led other countries to reconsider their engagement with NATO, including Finland and Sweden. Together with Austria, Cyprus, Ireland, and Malta, Finland and Sweden are the only EU states that are not members of NATO. Oh, EU states. That's why I misread it before. Okay. Both have been militarily neutral since World War II, although the end of the Cold War reignited the NATO question in both countries. After deciding to remain militarily neutral in the 1990s, both eventually abandoned their political neutrality when they joined the European Union together in 1995. That's another thing, I think. I feel that more international cooperation and more reliance on one another is really important. I want, the Scandinavian countries, as like a Swede myself, I want us to do things together. I want us to have that spirit of collectivism there, of being in the same boat and doing things together. It was a great thing when Sweden and Finland both joined together in 1995, and I think that doing things together, Finland and Sweden, is a good thing because hey, there's a lot of there's a lot of similarities, a lot of cooperation, a lot of historical interplay and contemporary interplay between the two countries when it comes to how they run and cultural aspects and whatever. I think it's good if we do stuff together. So if we are to join NATO, I think that's also something that should be done together in a show of like solidarity and in a show of like collectivism and international solidarity for these things. Finland and Sweden's policies of military non-alignment have persisted to the present, although renewed threats of Russian aggression are prompting conversations of their potential NATO membership. Once again, the best arguments for NATO are the ones provided by the Russians. It's actually it's unbelievable. If Russia was genuinely so concerned about like NATO, expansions and whatever, then they have done the most counterintuitive thing they ever could do. But that's not their main thing. The main thing they don't care about is a fight for NATO. The main thing they care about is expanding their influence. But yeah. This report examines Finland and Sweden's prospects of NATO accession since the end of the Cold War. It explores domestic debates surrounding NATO membership and asks if one country could feasibly join without the other. If these countries join NATO, it would fundamentally change the security constellation in Northern Europe. Also, NATO membership would irrevocably change Finland and Sweden's historical identities as neutral countries. Finally, the paper discusses the implications for the future, arguing that while it is most likely that neither country accedes to NATO in the near term, if they did join, it would be together-based. Given Sweden and Finland's deep business, cultural, and historical ties, it is reasonable to believe that the two countries will continue to deepen their commitments to NATO in light of tension in Ukraine, but this will stop short of pursuing full membership. Nonetheless, we acknowledge their differences which stem from unique historical paths, social values, identity, and political preferences. As former Finnish President Tarja Halonen put it, Finland and Sweden are sisters, but not twins. For all of their commonalities, the two have different motivations and desires around NATO membership. Background. Finland's unique relationship with Russia is largely a result of its history. Prior to its independence in 1917, Finland had been a part of both Sweden and Russia. For almost 700 years, Finland was part of Sweden until the Finnish War of 1809, when Finland became autonomous part of the Russian Empire. The Winter War, 1939, and Continuation War, 41-44, significantly shaped Finnish-Soviet relations. The foreign policy approach adopted by President Paasikivi and President Kekkonen, the Paasikivi-Kekkonen Doctrine, positioned Finland as a neutral country during the Cold War while maintaining good relations with its neighbor to the east. This doctrine was enabled by the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, FCMA, signed in 1948 by Finland and the Soviet Union. This treaty would serve as the main instrument in Finno-Soviet relations from 1948 to 1992. To honor the doctrine and not provoke the Soviet Union, Finland declined funding from the Marshall Plan, which was the United States funding plan, following the Second World War, in order to rebuild Europe from a lot of the damages sustained, but also, obviously, in order to kind of further like Western influence and be like, hey, we're going to help you out here. So we want more like relations with you when it comes to diplomatic relations, trade relations, and military relations and stuff like that. It is widely held that the treaty was signed under pressure from the Soviet Union, but it is widely held that this treaty was signed under pressure from the Soviet Union. I assume that they're talking about the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. No, sorry. Yeah, it was that one, right? Or was it the Paasikivi-Kekkonen Doctrine? I'm not sure which one they're referring to. To honor the doctrine and not provoke the Soviet Union, Finland declined funding for the Marshall Plan. It is widely held that this treaty was signed under pressure from the Soviet Union, but it granted Finland enough freedom to become a prosperous democracy. Sweden has not joined a military alliance or participated in any war since 1814, a peace spanning over 200 years. A lot of people don't know this. Europe, a lot of people have a pretty good idea, but Americans in World War II, Sweden actually remained completely neutral during the entirety of World War II. And once the Nazis were at the borders, they're like, we're remaining neutral. You can use our rail, you can do what you want, but we're remaining neutral as a nation. Sweden remained completely neutral in World War II, and that was one of the reasons why Sweden had such a great period of economic, gain right after World War II, because they were one of the few countries that weren't terribly war-torn following World War II, and they also had a lot of important natural resources that the rest of Europe needed in order to build back up. So that's why Sweden became very, very prosperous after the World War II, as a combination of those two things. After World War II, Sweden was at a crossroads in its defense policy as traditional powers fell and new powers arose. Rather than joining the US side of the Cold War, but with no interest in aligning with the Soviet Union, Sweden sought a third way to ensure its defense and regional stability. Sweden's attempt to create a neutral Scandinavian defense alliance in 1948 was ultimately unsuccessful. Norway and Denmark aligned with NATO instead, prompting Sweden to return to its policy of neutrality. Unlike Finland, which joined the Warsaw Pact nations in refusing the Marshall Plan aid, the economic circumstances of post-war Sweden and the attraction of economic aid offered by the United States brought Sweden into Western orbit. In exchange for recovery assistance, Sweden provided secret intelligence to Western powers throughout the Cold War, both bilaterally and through NATO. A clear example of this was Amber 9, the secret flight path over southwest Sweden. In 1981, a Soviet whiskey-class submarine carrying nuclear weapons washed up on a rocky outcropping near a Swedish military base, prompting a fierce debate over Swedish neutrality in an incident that became known as Whiskey on the Rocks. Despite its public posture of neutrality throughout much of the Cold War, behind closed doors Sweden became a key partner of NATO in Northern Europe. Neutrality. The question of Sweden and Finland's neutrality is central to the larger question of NATO membership. For both countries, neutrality is fundamentally pragmatic as they rely on trade with Russia and the United States. The maneuverability offered by neutrality allows dialogue with both powers. Neutrality remains an appealing alternative to the great power competition that defines today's world. Finland is militarily non-aligned with an emphasis on a credible national defense. Politically, Finland has been a member of the European Union since 1995 and is bound by some of the Common Foreign and Security Policy (CFSP) outlined in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. With the CFSP, the Common Security and Defense Policy decrees the member states to commit and deploy resources for military or civilian missions for keeping peace, conflict prevention and crisis management, and influence policies violating international law or human rights, or policies disrespectful of the rule of law or democratic principles. Furthermore, Finland is an observer at the North Atlantic Cooperation Council. The current Finnish president, Sauli Niinistö, has repeatedly emphasized that Finland is politically aligned with the EU, but military unaligned, yet it retains the option to join NATO at any given time. Sweden, by contrast, does not share a border with Russia. Doesn't share a border. It does share a path, though. I can show you on the map here. So you can see here. So there's Russia here, and then there's St. Petersburg, and then there's this little passage here, and then you have access to Sweden here. But it's not the same as Finland. Sweden, obviously, as Finland shares a pretty large border. I think it's pretty well. Not if you count Belarus, then, which is practically a Moscow puppet state. But I think the size of this border is fairly similar to the size of this one for Finland. If not greater. But yeah, so they share a fairly similar border to what Ukraine has when it comes to, Finland and Russia versus Ukraine and Russia. Now, once again, this is not me saying that, like an invasion of Finland is equally likely. It's obviously not. Finland and Ukraine are vastly different states with a vastly different amount of, background and, political connections and diplomatic relations and history and stuff like that. However, it's important to note because they're talking about borders right now. But Sweden has one connection, but it's kind of through this little straits here, and it's purely aquatic. There is no land-to-land connection between Sweden and Russia. But yeah, let's keep reading. In public statements, the Swedish government declares it has a non-alignment policy which differs slightly from neutrality, yet is predicated on it. It sees this policy of non-alignment as a source of stability and security in the region and enjoys widespread public support of this stance, which recently I think has changed a bit. I think for the first time ever, Sweden is in favor of joining NATO for the most part. Let me look that up and see if that's true. Okay, we have NPR. We have 4 sources here, so we can look through them. We have Bloomberg, which is fairly reliable. Friday poll says 51% of Swedes, 48% of Finns back joining NATO. This is. Russia has warned both countries of military backlash, which once again, Russia has no reason not to threaten it. Even if they have zero intention of following through, there's no reason for them not to threaten it and make Sweden think twice, because obviously Russia doesn't want more countries joining NATO. It's not in their interest whatsoever. So overall it seems like a slight majority of Swedes and almost a majority of Finns are in favor of it. Let's check the second one. Support. What is this? Least biased, factual reporting high. Learning English. Support grows in Finland, Sweden for NATO membership. Let's see, do we have numbers? Late February, 41% of public supported NATO, 35% opposed it. So we have a lot of undecided here, which I should have checked for this one actually. 51% think their response should join Sweden, with 27% opposed. Okay, so it's not even that. It's 51% directly in favor, 27% opposed, and then the rest undecided, which is opposed to 51% in favor, 49% opposed. I wonder if they have the same one for Finland. The support for NATO has also jumped drastically in Finland. The poll supported 48% respondents in support. This doesn't say how many didn't want it though. This is a bit of an incomplete poll here. They only have the who didn't for the Sweden one. So let's keep reading here. 53% of citizens, a majority. This is, I think this one was, when was this published? March 5th. I think the other one was March 3rd, the Bloomberg one. If I remember correctly. I mean. March 4th was this one. This one was March 5th. Did something change in one day, really? This week, while 53% of the country was in favor and 28% was against. So it seems like it's the same as well in Finland, how the majority are in favor, around half as many are against, and the rest are most likely undecided. This seems to be pretty set in stone to be true. Financial Times, I think this is a pretty high as well. Yep, let's check this. Well, I'm going to read this article. I'm going to save this one for later, actually, and we'll read it after we finish the other one. And then NPR, reconsider idea of NATO membership. This one was, I think this was the earliest one. This was March 3rd. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is Wiley. More than 50% in favor. Those in favor outnumber those against. Wiley showed 53% in favor of Finland joining, with 28% against, with a 2.5% error margin, which is not going to change anything significantly. Sweden, 41%. This is late February though, which I think it's gone up since then. 41% as opposed to 35% opposition, which you still have a major, like more in favor of joining than not. But I think this has gone up to like, what was it, 51% recently? But yeah. All right, let's keep reading here. So it is true that yeah, it sees policy of non-alignment as a source of stability and security in the region and enjoys widespread public support on this stance. I wonder what their citation is for this. I should actually check this. But it seems like now more people want to join NATO in Sweden. This is a long article. Which one was it that I clicked on? This was citation 7. Swedish membership in NATO to be or not to be perspective. April 3rd. 2018. Okay, well, okay. So they were using a 2018 thing. Which, to be fair, beforehand, I don't think that there were a majority of Swedes that were in favor of it. But I think now it's for the first time a majority of Swedes are. So yeah. Swedish neutrality is flexible and is non-enshrined in law, as it is in Finland. It is declared and self-regulated. Despite Sweden's policy of neutrality, it maintained a high level of defense spending and interoperability throughout the Cold War with other Nordic nations, 3 of which were members of NATO: Norway, Denmark, Iceland. In the 1990s and 2000s, this level of defense spending in Sweden fell dramatically. Sweden also has mandatory conscription for all men since 1908, a policy that continues despite its neutrality. Throughout most of the Cold War, Washington regarded military neutrality as non-committal and a cause of uncertainty. It is unclear what the Swedish and Finnish response would be were war to break out. Washington pushed Sweden to join NATO, even offering to appoint a Swedish general as commander of the northern flank in 1951, with no formal agreement or framework for cooperation with NATO throughout the Cold War. Defense cooperation between Finland and Sweden and with the West was conducted on a bilateral level with the United States. This silent partnership primarily consisted of intelligence sharing. Moscow, on the other hand, has viewed neutrality favorably. As recently as 2022, January, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stated that policy of neutrality pursued by these countries is one of the most important contributions to the common European architecture and to ensure stability on the European continent. Once again, of course, Russia would say this. Russia doesn't like NATO being stronger because NATO is in opposition to their interest of expanding Russia and influencing Eastern European nations. So, of course, they're going to be like, oh, it's a great thing that these countries are neutral instead of joining NATO. Russia has historically reviewed NATO enlargement as infringing on its sphere of influence. Finnish and Swedish guarantees of neutrality have provided Moscow with assurances that they would not share a border with a NATO country were Finland to have joined the alliances. So this is weird, because Russia already does share a border with NATO countries. They share with those 2 countries there, which is, what is it, Latvia and Estonia. So, Yeah, Russia already does share a border with two NATO nations. So I don't know why the article writes this. That the guarantees neutrality provide them with assurance that they would not share a border with a NATO country, because they literally do share a border with a NATO country. So I'm not sure what this is. Um, the long history of neutrality and non-alignment is key to the current debate about NATO membership. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Sweden and Finland no longer had the strategic imperative to remain neutral. Both joined NATO's Partnership for Peace (PFP) program in May 1994 and joined the European Union on January 1st, 1995. Formally launched in 1994, the PFP program became a way for NATO to offer partnership to non-NATO members without the requirement for membership. The PFP program opened the door to the newly liberated countries from the former Soviet Union to participate in NATO activities. Proponents of the PFP focused on it as an avenue for deepening security with non-NATO members, while detractors saw it as an ineffectual half measure by countries hedging their bets. Although not explicitly a path to NATO membership, 13 countries that joined PFP program over the years became full NATO members. Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Joining the PFP program marked a compromise in Finland and Sweden, satisfying those opposed to NATO membership while allowing for some level of cooperation. Despite Russian opposition to NATO expansion, the door to NATO accession remains formally open. In theory, Sweden and Finland could join NATO at any time, provided there is enough popular support to justify this decision. The NATO debate in Finland and Sweden today. The debate around Finland joining NATO since the end of the Cold War tended to shift depending on the administration in power. While Cold War-era presidents Urho Kekkonen and Mario Koivisto explicitly rejected NATO membership, President Martti Ahtisaari, 1994-2000, strongly advocated for joining. The debate often featured themes ranging from security to political sovereignty to the question of identity. Furthermore, discussions circled around the timing of joining military alliances, as well as practical matters such as securing Finland's border with Russia. Supporters of NATO accession in Finland commonly argue that membership would ensure security for a rainy day. Concrete benefits to Finland joining NATO include, in addition to safety guarantees against Russia, deeper knowledge sharing of strategic regional intelligence. Good. Both Finland and Sweden frequently participate in military exercises, such as Trident Juncture of 2018, sharing information related to cyber defense, as well as committing resources to disaster management initiatives run by NATO. Opponents emphasize 1. The loss of Finland's military non-aligned status, 2. A considerable financial burden, and 3. A readiness to supply Finnish soldiers and military equipment to common NATO causes as arguments against NATO membership. Furthermore, the argument goes, as Finland already spends an ample amount of defense, it prefers investing additional resources in other areas such as education and healthcare. Russia would likely reinforce its border with Finland. Furthermore, Finland's historic trademark as a neutral mediator would be cast into doubt. Helsinki has hosted numerous summits and peace talks over the years. Finnish NATO memberships would also significantly weaken the Finno-Russian trust, a bond between the two countries that has been carefully repaired and maintained ever since the mid-1940s, where the Snow was speaking Finnish, and could lead to Russian aggression towards Finland. Currently, Finland is dependent on energy imports from Russia. As of 2019, Finland imports approximately 60% of its energy from Russia. Moreover, Finland has important bilateral trade relations with Russia. Russia was the fourth largest importer of Finnish goods in 2017. Additionally, about 70,000 individuals, or 1.2% of the population, speak Russian as their mother tongue, the third largest ethnic group after the Finnish Swedes, 5.2%. In the past, Russia has used Russian-speaking minorities in other countries as a pretext for military action. Yeah, I was about to mention that as well, that, you know, hey, saying that you have a portion of the population that that has Russian as their mother tongue and has great ties to Russia, while that, can in some views be interpreted as an argument against joining, NATO to not like piss off Russia or whatever. It's also like, hey, that's been used by Russia in the past to invade countries that are, not aligned with NATO on account of the fact that there are Russian-speaking minorities in these nations. So we just got to keep that in mind as well. In a 2016 report commissioned by the Finnish government on the possible effects of NATO membership, the Foreign Ministry ultimately concluded that Finland should not seek full membership. Finland, the report states, acknowledges its complex history and must adapt to a new situation if the currently strategical benefit environment significantly changes, and preferably together with Sweden. True. I think that's one of the things that are fairly inarguable with this, that whatever happens, Sweden and Finland must do it together. If they choose to not go in, or if they choose to go in, it must happen together. I think that's very important, not to leave the other one out to dry, so to say. Um, a decisive factor for a successful NATO accession is legitimacy as expressed with public opinion. According to a 2021 poll from 2,000 Finns' opinions on foreign and security policy, an annual poll commissioned by the Finnish Business and Policy Forum, approximately 26% of Finns are in favor of joining NATO. 40% are against joining NATO, while 33% are undecided. As Figure 1 shows, Finns' views of NATO have become more favorable in recent years, a trend that can potentially be explained by deteriorating domestic attitudes towards Russia, as well as the changes in US administrations. Under current conditions, given where the public sentiment surrounding the debate stands now, Finland would not seek membership but wishes to maintain that option. When was this written? February 2nd. Okay. So this was written before all this. So since then, I think that the major thing that's changed is that it now seems like there is more support than there is opposition towards joining NATO. So the reddish are opposed, the yellow or whatever, and the greens are in favor. Oops. Sweden. I don't think this is very too relevant, because if we've seen the current polling, then I don't know if I need to read through this. I'm gonna speed through this for myself. No, I think this is still important. Much of the current security debate in Sweden was shaped by a series of events in 2014, in turn accelerating Sweden's current attitudes towards NATO. While Russia had always been a security concern, it became a more acute threat in the last decade, prompting much of Sweden's increased militarization. Peter Hultqvist, Minister for Defense since 2014, has been a key figure in shaping current Swedish defense policy. Despite being a member of the Social Democrats Party that traditionally opposes NATO membership, Hultqvist has sought to bridge the gap between Sweden's non-alignment policy and its pledges for military solidarity to allies. Sweden reintroduced military conscription in 2017, prompted by the security change in our neighborhood. In 2021 to 2025 defense budget, Hultqvist has committed to one of the largest military expansions since the end of the Cold War, which includes increasing military spending by 40%, increasing the amount of Swedish military personnel from 60,000 to 90,000, and adding a fifth submarine to its navy. Sweden has strengthened its bilateral security cooperation with both Finland and the United States in recent years, and has grown closer to NATO than ever before. Russia's invasion of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 highlighted the need for enhancing Sweden's national defense. Closer to home, Sweden has reported multiple incursions into its waters and airspace, alarming the general public. Most signs indicate Russia is behind these incursions. A week-long 2014 hunt for a submarine thought to be of Russian origin that entered the Stockholm archipelago echoed in the 1980 submarine scares. This hunt resulted in the largest mobilization of Swedish forces since the end of the Cold War and was widely covered in media, gripping the Sweden's public attention. Despite not finding the submarine in question, it sent a shock through Sweden and shattered any illusion of tranquility. Russian jets routinely enter Swedish airspace, fly too close to Swedish aircrafts, and test the boundaries and responsiveness of Swedish defense. The most infamous incident occurred over Easter weekend in 2013. Russian jets performed a mock attack on Sweden in a training exercise. Sweden was too slow to react to the Russian jets, but Danish NATO jets scrambled from a base in Lithuania to meet them. This trend of foreign incursions into Sweden's waters and airspace has continued for the better part of the past decade, with no signs of abating. In 2020, 2 Russian warships entered Swedish territorial waters near Gothenburg without receiving authorization. A series of mysterious drones flying near the royal palace at Drottningholm, a water treatment center near Norsburg, nuclear power stations in January 2022 amidst threats of a Russian invasion in Ukraine further highlights unusual activity that could push the Swedish public towards joining NATO. So yeah, if there's one other thing that is an important takeaway, it seems that, and that it's important to note that Russia gives zero fucks about protocol, about agreements, about authorizations, about those things. They will push the limits, they will push, and see how much they can take without there being pushback, and sometimes they will just try to take it. Such as the situation in Ukraine, given all the agreements that they violated, that have been signed between Ukraine and other parties, and of course Russia, in order to be able to do that. So this seems to be like a general trend of Russia, where they keep pushing, and they keep doing their thing, and they keep like testing the boundaries, unless there's like a hard stop for them to like, stop, you can't fucking do this, but In Sweden, a government-backed inquiry on potential NATO membership in 2016 recommended Sweden not join NATO to avoid a potential backlash from Russia. Moscow has made it abundantly clear that if Sweden were to join NATO, there would be a consequence of retaliatory nature. Interestingly, the report addresses a potential accession process that states it could take approximately a year. So I'm not sure exactly how seriously to take these threats from Russia, because once again, like I stated previously, there is no reason for Russia not to say that and not to make the decision to join NATO as difficult and as reluctant as possible, because they have nothing to lose and everything to gain from that as Russia. And also, they don't seem to have a history of fucking with nations who are part of NATO, because they know what that means. And they don't want that. And they can't deal with that. So, from the information I have right now, I don't think that there is that these threats of, like, you know, backlash from Russia ought to be taken too seriously when it comes to deciding what we do with NATO. Because if we join NATO, then there's nothing Russia can do anymore. They haven't shown that pattern of behavior. However, they have shown the pattern of behavior that they will continuously fuck with nations who are not part of NATO. But once they tend to join NATO, Russia tends to be pretty hands-off. So, once again, given the motives for making those threats, given the past history we see between the engagement of Russia between Sweden and Ukraine, NATO countries and Russia, it doesn't seem like these threats hold a lot of merit specifically. But maybe I'll be wrong. Who knows? Hopefully not. One of the largest questions surrounding Swedish membership in NATO is the fate of Gotland, an island of strategic importance in the Baltic Sea. U.S. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges states that there is no island as strategically important as Gotland during exercises in 2017. Since late 2017, Gotland has hosted a permanent garrison of Swedish soldiers, for the first time since 2005. This is in direct response to Russian aggression in the last decade, and has attracted significant media attention as more troops, vehicles, and equipments are stationed in Gotland. A strong Gotland will act as a stabilizing force in the region. It operates as an ideal power projection point for Sweden and potentially NATO in both the Baltic Sea and the Baltic countries, if they were under attack from Russia. In a press conference in January 2022 between the heads of NATO, Finland, and Sweden, NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg praised Sweden for enhancing its military presence on Gotland to secure the Baltic Sea in light of the Russian buildup of troops. Swedish public support for NATO membership has evolved since the early 1990s, with the gap narrowing between those supporting joining NATO and those against, as seen in Figure 2. A poll from 2014 to 2017 by Ipsos interestingly showed that while those in favor of Sweden joining NATO has remained constant, those against have declined from 56% against in April 2014 to 44% against in December 2017. And the share of those undecided has grown in share, suggesting those against NATO memberships are changing their opinions or are re-evaluating. This trend has continued in more recent polls, such as in 2019, 46% were in favor of joining, with 34% against and 20% undecided. A 2022 poll by Demoscop showed support for NATO accession by 42% of respondents and opposition by 37% of respondents. While support in recent years hovers around 40%, it is not enough for a public call for politicians to pursue NATO memberships. Okay, we're almost done, guys. But yeah, once again, right now there's a vast majority, or there's a majority on its own, an absolute majority in favor of joining NATO, and then there's also, yeah, if I have an absolute majority, it's obviously going to be a majority no matter what. I don't know what I'm saying. Finland and Sweden's future with NATO. The continued debate on NATO in Finland and Sweden demonstrates that the question of membership has not been definitively decided. At the time of writing this report in early February 2022, uncertainty abounds. Europeans are still rattled by 4 years of the Trump administration casting aspersions on NATO. This is very true. This is one of the main things that Swedes worry about when it comes to NATO. They're like, hey, you know, NATO seems fine, but every 4 years you might get some absolute American nutcase who is going to be in charge of the thing, and we don't know if we like that very much. Russia is an unpredictable actor with a penchant for invading to bolster Putin's domestic approval ratings. Transatlantic relations are at a low point after a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, the mishandling of the AUKUS submarine deal, and the world continues to grapple with an unending global pandemic. Although it is unlikely Russia will act against the Nordics in a way that the membership in NATO could actively prevent, it is worth exploring the options available to Sweden and Finland, options that are complicated by identity, neutrality, and a long history with Russia. It is most likely that there will be no dramatic change in the relationship between Finland, Sweden, and NATO, despite the current escalations and tensions of Ukraine. Oh boy, that probably didn't age very well. When did the invasion start exactly? When did Russian invasion start? I assume it's going to know that I'm talking about Ukraine. Yeah, 20th of February. Well, I guess technically, I mean, there has been more talks about it, but not specifically. But obviously, the tensions in Ukraine have escalated massively. So yeah. But once again, writers of the article, they can't have known this. So yeah. And they don't make any claims about how Russia's not going to invade, unlike some other people in the political sphere. Infrared. But yeah. Russia will continue its aggressive foreign policy, meddling in other countries' elections, cyberspace, or even conducting or threatening hybrid warfare. Incursions in Sweden and Finnish airspace have waterways will likely continue, which may stoke further support of NATO. The threat of invasion of Ukraine might further drive Finland and Sweden to deepen NATO cooperation, but to avoid antagonizing Russia and without widespread popular support for membership, the two may ultimately decide to never join the alliance. Sorry. It is possible that one country will join without the other. I hope to God not. Sweden traditionally has a larger public support for NATO membership, capitalizing on Russia's incursion into Swedish airspace with mounting public demand for security guarantees. A referendum could be held in Sweden and a clear majority could indicate a preference for NATO membership. Without the same level of public support in Finland for NATO membership, their defense features would diverge. We see this scenario as unlikely as it would threaten to destabilize the region, and decoupling its security from Finland to align with NATO would make Finland more vulnerable. Absolutely. It needs to... Please, Swinland. Swinland and Finland, okay? Don't mess this up, okay? If you do something, do it together. But yeah, absolutely. Although unlikely given the low popularity for NATO within Finland, once again, that's changed. A Russian permutation of Ukraine's border might prompt Finland to join NATO without Sweden. And yeah, that's an interesting thing, actually, how if you just look at the map and did nothing else, like, you'd be like, okay, knowing NATO, Finland would probably be more in favor of joining than what Sweden is. But that's actually not the case. Finland has lower approval for NATO than what Sweden is, partly because of the history between Finland and Russia, when it comes to all the things they talked about before, but also because of all the encroachments on Sweden airspace and territory and stuff like that by the Russians, which are making people increasingly suspicious. So once again, God, Russia is doing the dumbest things if they really don't want us to join NATO. Like, if you don't want Sweden to join NATO, then why are you doing these things onto Sweden and, like, you know, moving, you know, doing these troop movements, like infiltrating airspace and water space and stuff like that? God, it's almost as if their main interest isn't to prevent NATO, but to expand their own influence, and they're using NATO expansionism as a cover for that. If Finland joins NATO, Sweden would be surrounded by NATO allies, and its interest to join the alliance would wane. Yes, but I still think it's important to remain the solidarity there. Plus, there is still technically a connection between Russia and Sweden in that case, and in that case, Russia is going to be kind of desperate, but who knows. With Finland in the alliance, NATO's borders now presses up against Russia's. Once again, this is already the case. I don't know why this article doesn't seem to think about Estonia and Latvia. Maybe there's a particular reason for that, but yeah. We see this feature as unlikely due to Finland's dependence on energy imports from Russia, trade relationship, and unique historical relationship with Russia. So once again, obviously it's going to put pressure on the trade relations, but it doesn't make it impossible by any means. So they're already part of the European Union, which already makes that relationship. I think Finland's part of the European Union, right? Yeah, they do have Euro. Okay, yeah, so they're full. They're in the Eurozone and they're part of the EU. But they still have trade relations or whatever. And then there's other things like, you know, you have the whole Nord Stream 2 thing between a bunch of NATO-aligned countries and Russia. So it doesn't make it not possible to have these trade relationships. Obviously, it's going to strain it a little bit and make it maybe a bit more unlikely. But you see plenty of NATO countries, you see plenty of EU countries still able to have relations and trade relations with Russia when it comes to oil and stuff like that. I don't think that this will be a significant concern because, once again, you know, it's a two-way street there between Russia and Finland, and at this point in time, Russia can't quite afford to cut itself off from more international trading partners at this point in time. So this argument about, you know, energy dependence or whatever, and making trade more difficult. I don't find that particularly convincing. But for much of its bilateral rejections, Finland has carefully nurtured a rapport with Russia and would be unwilling to risk this precarious dynamic. It is unlikely that either country would join NATO without the other, as both have expressed solidarity in joining due to their deep defense cooperation. The two countries not only have a deep pre-existing defense cooperation on a bilateral level, but also cooperate in a multilateral forum such as the Nordic Defence Cooperation, the European Union, the United Nations, and NATO. Both have a strong interest in maintaining stability in the Baltic Sea region. A 2014 action plan, signed by the defense ministers of Sweden and Finland, established a number of concrete joint projects to pursue that further bids the future of their security together. Due to their high levels of interoperability and operational capabilities, no decision about NATO membership would be made without close consultations between the two countries. In the meantime, NATO respects Finland and Sweden's independence and decision not to join the alliance, and does not pressure either country to make a decision regarding membership. Finally, Finland and Sweden have deep business, cultural, and historical ties. While the two have different motivations around NATO memberships, they share deeply held beliefs about their place in the Western community. If an accession were to happen, if a story's any guide, Finland and Sweden would likely join NATO together. Based. Conclusion. Given the state of public opinion in both Sweden and Finland, it is unlikely that either country will join NATO in the foreseeable future, barring any significant changes in the relationship between EU and Russia. This corresponds with two government reports published in recent years, sponsored by the governments of Finland and Sweden respectively. These reports concluded that NATO membership would not be advantageous to either country, as it would disrupt their precious balance of power in the region. Although hardly the final word in the ongoing debate on NATO membership, both reports highlight the current concerns and views of the governments of Sweden and Finland, and provide the best insights into the prospects of membership. Once again, this has changed a lot over the past month. Most notably in public opinion. I think at the very least, this might already be in the process. Hold on, because they talk about there was a report that was being done here. But at the very least, a new report where you weigh it is definitely warranted, because those reports were done in 2016. The situation has changed a lot since then. Russia has demonstrated a very a clear escalation in how aggressive they are since then. So I think if you did a new evaluation, maybe things would be weighed differently. So I do recommend at the very least new reports to be done. However, there is also the issue of time sensitivity, and a lot of people are really nervous, rightfully so, given the current situation. So you have that issue, but I don't know how long it took to produce the first report, but most definitely get a report in the works on this to try to reevaluate it, because the situation has changed dramatically since 5-6 years ago when those were conducted first. This could all change in the event of a large-scale conflict in Europe. Well, there we go. Public support for joining NATO alliance is at a record high in Sweden and Finland as a result of the ongoing tensions. If the worst should occur in Ukraine, which it has, I don't know if they mean the worst is in a complete, Russia steamrolling them, or if they just mean as in an invasion, which has happened. I think they just mean as an invasion, so the worst has occurred. But if the worst should occur in Ukraine, it would only drive Sweden and Finland away from non-alignment and towards NATO membership. True, as it has. If one of the main reasons to not join NATO is to avoid disrupting the precarious balance of power in the region, and Russia disrupts the balance by invading Ukraine, it would make NATO membership a viable option for Finland and Sweden. True. In this case, it is highly likely that Finland and Sweden would join together as they did in 1995 with the EU. So are they saying that it's likely that they will join, or are they just saying that it's likely that if they were to join, they would join together? Because they seem like they're saying it's a viable option, and if they join, they're going to join together. That seems more likely what they're saying, instead of them saying it's likely that they join if there was an invasion to happen. The option of joining NATO remains up to Sweden and Finland themselves, respectively, and cannot be made for them or by any outside party. This has been reaffirmed by Sweden and Finland's leadership in light of recent Russian aggression. In his 2022 New Year's speech, Finnish President Niinistö said, Finland's room to maneuver and freedom of choice also includes the possibility of military alignment and applying for NATO membership should we ourselves so decide. When Russia's foreign military spokeswoman said that there would be grave political and military consequences if either Sweden or Finland joined NATO, Swedish Minister for Foreign Affairs Ann Linde responded, it should not be up to Russia if we could join or if we could not join NATO. True, we can't let Russia bully our geopolitics. The NATO option is a powerful tool in their arsenal that ensures further stability and leverage in negotiations. Ultimately, the decision of whether to join NATO rests with Finland and Sweden themselves, although a Russian invasion of Ukraine might finally answer the NATO question after decades of neutrality, non-alignment, and re-evaluation of the security risks posed to Russia. Okay, I'm gonna give my take right now. This is what I think. I think I am. I think I am. I'm in favor. I'm leaning towards being in favor of joining NATO. Still, though, the most important thing for me is that whatever happens, it happens together. That's the most important thing. Easily the most important thing. It's not even close. So I would rather they don't join it, like, and nobody joins NATO, but neither of them join NATO, than one of them does and the other one doesn't. So I think if I would rank it, I would say worst case is one joins NATO, the other one doesn't. I think that's absolute worst case. Middle case is if both of them abstained, and I think right now I'm in favor of both of them joining, and I'm gonna substantiate that. So number one, Russia has demonstrated a clear increase in aggression. They will push boundaries. They will be very aggressive. They will initiate invasions. It's a risk, and that risk has now increased since before when it comes to whether or not they might invade or not. And no matter if you perceive the risk to be small, it's undeniably significantly increased since what's happened recently. So let's talk about the arguments, the main arguments against Finland joining here. So the loss of Finland's military non-aligned status, sure, I think that is unfortunate, but I think that's a fine cost to take in regards to being more insulated against Russian aggression in the future. A considerable financial burden, it is definitely a financial burden, but once again, I think that financial burden is outweighed by an insulation, a way greater insulation against interference by Russia, and thus I think the financial burden tends to pale in comparison, and there are reforms and things that can be made and to modify that financial burden. So that can be changed and that can be modified, but the benefits are very clear. 3. A readiness to supply Finnish soldiers and military equipment to common NATO causes as arguments against NATO membership. Once again, I mean, this is kind of like this is more like a nationalistic thing, like, hey, if we join this, then we're committed to support with Finnish soldiers and equipment to common NATO causes. And, what's Finland's purpose in doing that? For me, as like an internationalist, as somebody who cares about globalism a lot, as somebody who thinks it's important to have international cooperations and security and safety nets, I don't think this is a negative thing. I think this is a positive thing, that we have more interconnected and more interwoven defense structures generally in our geopolitical climate. They talk about Helsinki and how that's like previously a place for neutrality. True. But I think that another way to do it could probably be, okay, I see something else now. I was gonna say Switzerland can take that role, and I still think that they can to a pretty significant extent, because Switzerland is a neutral country. They're still not part of NATO, and Switzerland is clear. Switzerland has zero risk for Russian interference, because they have all the countries to the east that are part of NATO. You have the west, you have the south, like completely surrounded by NATO nations. It's they're clear. They're very clear. They're strong. They have a strong like domestic military as well. They don't need to worry about Russian interference. They can afford not to join NATO, and the risks of that are way lower than for Sweden and Finland. And that could probably just be like the bastion of neutrality there, where you can be like, hey, you can come here for these meetings. Once again, Russia might be like, oh, it's not the same. With Helsinki, we share a border, with the country of Finland, between like kind of like Western and, Eastern interests. But I mean, a country's a country, unless they're worried about like, I don't know, like there being like I'm not sure what the worry is there. I can understand like intuitively it might feel like, okay, Finland is better because it shares two borders, whereas Switzerland is completely surrounded by NATO. But I think as long as Switzerland remains neutral, it will effectively fill the same purpose. So yeah, Switzerland can fill this function much better. They're in the clear. They have no connection, no border connection, no water connections or anything to Russia. They can afford to remain neutral, and I think Switzerland should do that. I think Switzerland has an important purpose in remaining neutral and to be a place of arbitration and be a place of meetings of international forces and stuff like that. I don't think Switzerland should join NATO. I am actively opposed to Switzerland joining NATO because I think it's important to have that one spot, to have at least one spot. Once again, it sucks that you're losing another one of those spots with Helsinki, but there's so much more at stake with Finland not joining NATO than there is with with Switzerland not joining NATO. So I think that can still be retained there in a pretty reasonable way. And once again, another thing is that Russia keeps pushing the boundaries there with Sweden with those military exercises and stuff like that. It's good to retain that and to be like, hey, you can't do this. Furthermore, we cannot let Russia keep dictating our terms for how we choose to have these negotiations. Hold on, there's somebody at the door. But yeah, that's another thing about the differentiation there between keeping something neutral, which would be Switzerland, that would be excellent there. But Finland will lose that, sure. But I think you still have Switzerland there as like the main neutral thing. Russia's demonstrated the capacity and the capability to keep pushing limits there in Sweden, yeah, I think that's important to be like, no, you can't do that. Furthermore, Russia can't be allowed to bully international stage and make like determinations of, oh no, you're not allowed to join NATO or whatever. Once again, they have no reason not to make this threat, even if they have no intention of backing it up. Yeah, being like, hey, there is some response. There's going to be pushback from the actions you take and the actions of like military aggression you take against Ukraine. And if that is going to be more membership of NATO, that sucks. But we need to be able to, as a world, accept that and not allow Russia to bully us into, not doing things or doing things in a specific way or whatever on the basis of that. So that's another thing that I want to add there, specifically when it comes to the geopolitical thing. And also, I'm an internationalist. I like international cooperation. NATO has issues, just as the EU has issues, but I'm in favor of more economic integration and military integration and the rest of it. I hope I unmuted myself. I did unmute myself. And because of that, I just have a general predisposition, like almost ideological, but obviously on the basis of the consequences thereof for these military alliances and stuff like that. So I'm still in favor of that there. But yeah, so right now I'm kind of leaning a bit in favor of, hey, you should probably join NATO when it comes to Sweden and Finland there. But yeah, let's keep reading the second article there. So Sweden's prime minister doesn't seem to be particularly in favor of joining NATO. So we'll keep reading this statement then. Sweden's prime minister says push to join NATO would destabilize Northern Europe. Magdalena Andersson rules out talks on the issue, citing heightened tensions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Sweden's center-left prime minister has ruled out applying to join NATO, saying that membership would destabilize the security of Northern Europe. After a surge in Swedish support for joining the military alliance following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, opposition center-right party leaders have urged the government to start a discussion on possible NATO membership. But Social Democrat Prime Minister Magdalena Andersson has turned down the request for talks. If Sweden were to choose to submit its membership application in the current situation, it would further destabilize the security of this particular region of Europe and increase tensions in Europe. And Sweden would contribute to further destabilizing this situation, she said on Tuesday. I don't think this feels like a really big stretch of the thing. If we're willing to get to the point where Sweden independently choosing to join a military alliance in opposition to a country that is currently engaging in jingoism and in an invasion of Ukraine at the given time, then at this point we're just gonna have to take that on the shoulder, and we're gonna be like, okay, sure, I mean, it might escalate some forms of tensions, but in a lot of ways it's also going to reduce tensions, right? Because more things are off the table for Russia to do, so in that way it's beneficial. But I don't think we can allow Russia to have this grasp and this control over the discourse on this topic, where you allow this to happen. But I don't think it would further destabilize the region in any way, shape, or form. I think it would make it more stable. I think it would make people more confident in the military security of their nations in this given question. But yeah, so I don't buy this at all. That would contribute to further destabilizing the situation. It would absolutely not. I don't think it'll make a significant difference. Her comments then, in contrast to neighboring Finland, where centre-left Premier Sanna Marin has promised a quick and comprehensive debate among party leaders over whether it should join NATO. Good. I said before that I was in favor of a report taking place, but if it's a debate among party leaders, then I mean that's fine. Sweden and Finland are the only two of the Nordic Baltic countries non-NATO, and public opinion in both countries has swung massively in favor of membership of the military alliance. This is true. Neither country is neutral any longer since they joined the EU, and both have close military partnerships with both NATO and the US. Some Swedish commentators criticize Andersson's choice of words, even if the Social Democrats' opposition to NATO membership is long-standing. Citing Prime Minister's use of the word destabilizing, Anna Dahlberg, political editor of tabloid Expressen, said, calling Expressen a tabloid is a bit weird. Because it's not just a tabloid. The tabloid has like a very kind of like the Sun connotation to it, but Expressen does reporting. They do news reporting as well. So it's more like Swedish news source, Expressen. Expressen isn't just a tabloid. So yeah, this is a bad choice of words. But they said, why does the Prime Minister accept the perspective of the Kremlin? True, you can't let Russia dictate the terms. I don't know if this is obviously a bit inflammatory. It's reporting, it's journalism. They're going to put it in this way. But yeah. Ulf Kristersson, leader of the Sweden's main opposition moderate party, called Andersson's comments very unfortunate and said that they risk causing a split between Sweden and Finland in a dangerous way. Several commentators point out that Sweden ruling out NATO membership could complicate a Finnish bid. True, at the end of the day, I do think that Finland probably has a bigger stake in this than what Sweden has. Most definitely have a bigger stake in this than what Sweden has, whether you're talking about culturally, whether you're talking about historically, whether you're talking about when it comes to borders, whether you're talking about things that are being lost, like the neutrality and things like Helsinki being a place for meetings and stuff like that. Finland absolutely has the biggest stake in this compared to Sweden. And if Finland and the Finnish government and the Finnish people are willing to take that step, I think it's wrong for the Swedish government and the Swedish leadership to be like, oh no, it might destabilize, so let's not do it. And yeah, once again, if Sweden is like, no, we're not gonna do it, but Finland does it, that's not bad. Like I said, that's my bottom outcome from this, from my current understanding. It had long been assumed that Sweden would lead in taking the two countries in NATO, but increasingly it seems as if Finland, with half the population, is pulling ahead. Marin said on Monday during a visit to the neighboring Estonia, we're moving quickly, although these discussions will be thorough. Kristersson said earlier on Tuesday that Finland was setting up the pace for this country and urged Stockholm to discuss potential membership. We're in a completely new situation, and so, just like in Finland, we need to make an analysis of what serves Sweden's interest, added the moderate leader, a supporter of NATO membership. Victory for Sweden's opposition parties in parliamentary elections in September could swing the political argument in favor of talks about joining the alliance. An opinion poll last week showed that the majority of Finns supported joining NATO for the first time. Party and parliamentary leaders are set for talks again this week, with Sauli Niinisto, president, who has previously called on them to keep a cool head on the issue. Swedish opinion polls have also showed in recent days either a majority or a plurality more in favor than against for memberships. The surge in support comes as Finns and Swedes react to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, also a non-NATO member. NATO countries have offered Kyiv weapons and moral support, but have so far been unwilling to provide troops or enforce a no-fly zone as Ukraine's officials have demanded. Leaders in the Baltic countries are particularly keen to have Finland and Sweden in NATO because of their strategic locations. With a length of 1,340 kilometers, Finland has the longest border of any EU country with Russia, while analysts say that Sweden's island of Gotland could function as an aircraft carrier in the middle of the Baltic Sea. Kaja Kallas, Estonia's prime minister, told Marin that she could allay any fears. Allay? I'm not sure what this means. Allay definition. Diminish or put to rest. I'd never heard this word before. That she could put to rest, allay any fears of joining NATO would weaken Finland's security. Finland and Sweden's accession would strengthen NATO, but I believe it would strengthen Finland and Sweden's own security as well, she added. Yeah. I disagree with Magdalena Andersson, the Swedish prime minister, on this. I feel like this is saying that joining NATO is going to destabilize the region. I don't think so at all, and I think it gives merit to Russia. It shows that we're tiptoeing around Russia's demands on this given interest. I think it's the opposite of what will actually happen. I think it will increase security in the region. Of course, you will have like a tense situation as the process begins and being like, okay, is Russia going to do something or what's going to happen? But once again, we can't let threats from Russia like this just keep perpetuating and guiding all the decisions from independent democratic nations on whether or not they want to join a defensive military alliance such that is NATO. So yeah, I think overall then we can do a bit of a summary. So Sweden and NATO, Sweden and Finland are, neither of them are currently part of NATO. There is cooperation that exists within them. There is complications to joining, or more so to say, arguments against joining that are reasonable and are valid concerns to have. I do, however, think that with the increase of Russian aggression and them increasing and showing that they have the capacity and the willingness to bully around, both historically and now contemporarily with Ukraine, nations that aren't part of NATO, I think that balances there have changed, and new things need to be done and new things need to be changed, and like new decisions have to be made. That weighing has to change, and I think at this point, I'm slightly in favor of joining NATO, both for Finland and for Sweden. However, once again, the worst possible outcome would be if only one joined and the other one didn't. But I think overall it would be most beneficial if both of them joined. Increase international cooperation, increase security against potential Russian threats, a clear putting down like, no, we will not let Russia dictate the terms of our geopolitical engagements and our joining of, you know, alliances and other agreements when it comes to international cooperation and stuff like that. I think it's overall a positive, and most of the negatives I've heard against it, I don't think are significant negatives. The loss of neutrality is probably the biggest one, but I would hope Switzerland is able to take that role, and they ought to keep that as like one of the major things they've going on there. The increased cost, sure, that sucks, but once again, I think that's a cost that's, you know, willing to be paid over more, you know, domestic security when it comes to the risk for invasions and stuff like that. Which in itself can actually have negative economic effects, given like if there's like insecurity about things going on. I'm sure that whenever there is one of the things that happens with you know, Russia, where they where they fly their planes too close to Sweden, or they have the submarines going on or stuff like that, it does bring instability, it does hurt Sweden's economy and stuff like that. So I think that security would increase one of the major things that are important for economic growth, which is faith in the stability of the region. And thus I think it would also bring some economic positives as well that go beyond just the direct costs that come with joining NATO and stuff like that. An example I could give for more of the kind of cost benefit to join the NATO thing would be, let's say you had something wrong with your car, and it's something that could in the future just like completely ruin your car, like complete, like it's done, your car's done, it's totaled, you're not getting any money for it, you can't drive it anymore, it's done, you gotta get a brand new car, okay? And you need to pay like a little bit of a fee to get something changed, or to keep some upkeep going on the vehicle. Now if you don't pay that fee, it's not for sure that your car is gonna completely like crash and no longer work and no longer function, but it's always a possibility. That's kind of how I see the NATO thing, right? Is that, hey, you know, if you join NATO, then you will never have the problem, but you don't know if you would have had the problem of like increased Russian aggression if you hadn't paid that fee. It's hard to know for sure, because NATO is kind of like a dissuasionary thing, just like with the car. Just because, you know, if you do pay the thing and you never see any like Russian aggression, that could be because you're paying the thing, right? It's because you're paying the fee into NATO. But should you not pay it, and something happens to your car, or, you know, Russia decides to invade, then you're fucked. You're gonna wish that you paid that fee all along. So it's kind of like an insurance policy type thing, maintenance thing there. But it's not like an insurance policy in the sense that like, hey, you know, when something goes wrong, you'll know for sure, like, oh, thank God that I did this. Because a lot of NATO is like dissuasionary. So you'll never know for sure whether or not your decision to pay this was like you know, paid off, and it actually prevented a bad thing from happening. Because you don't know, like, once again, if you paid the thing for your car, you don't know if it actually would have broken down if you hadn't paid it, if you could like risk that there and you would have been fine. But it's still like a responsible decision to pay that anyway and to insulate yourself from that risk. So by joining NATO, is the fear of Sweden being dragged to unethical military associated like the Serbian Kosovo bombings, which were now mandated by the UN? I think it's possible. I don't know how much more. I think I could add this as well. Actually, this can be added to the other thing. So Zoe, if you could just add the clip as well. when it comes to concerns of like Sweden or Finland being thrown into like conflicts that are unethical, I don't know how much materially things are improved by by Russia or by Sweden or Finland abstaining from those things. I think what's probably a lot more likely is that, hey, once you're part of NATO as a military alliance, you probably have a bigger voice in those internal affairs and in what NATO does. So while it's, sure, you can be like, okay, well, NATO does, some unjust military action sometimes through the invocation of like Article 5 or whatever, and they're really negative. So we're not going to join NATO and we're going to keep our hands clean, and not be involved in this NATO stuff. Sure, I mean, you could say that, but alternatively, hey, you're going to be part of NATO. Whether or not you participate in it isn't going to affect much, but once you're part of NATO, you might have a stronger voice in being able to voice opposition against those types of things, against, like unjust military operations or whatever. Once you're already inside it, you probably have a bigger voice there. So I think that's probably what I would say on that specifically, Alex. Yeah, I think at the moment I'm in favor of Sweden joining NATO, and Finland doing it as well, and them doing it at the same time. I think it seems like a reasonable thing to do. A new report should be done at the very least, but conversations should be had. Both of them should do it at the same time, and probably better if the process is fairly swift, more than being, extremely drawn out. But yeah, that's what I would say.